I think when we're talking about quality issues as well, it's always important to partner with your vendor, right? Don't keep information from them. Talk to your vendor, share the experiences that you're having with your vendor, give your vendor an opportunity to address them. That's really, really important rather than just jumping ship necessarily. But you've got to kind of listen to both sides, and it's going to help you make decisions on how to proceed. Or do we need to move to another product? Do we need to focus on education because staff aren't using it quite right? And so make sure you are having that dialogue with your team.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Joining us on this episode is Robby Miller, Manager Sterile Processing at Dignity Health, St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona. And we're going to be talking to Robby today about managing consumables. We've went the whole season and talked about a lot of specific consumables and all the technical and all the best practices. But on this episode, we're going to talk to Robby about what that high-level approach and insight looks like, right? What does this look like from 30,000 feet, and then drill down into some of the applicabilities of those insights beyond just that manager chair. What does it look like for Joe Technician or Susan Technician to also be involved in the critical decision making and managing of consumables every single day in sterile processing? So hang with us. It's going to be a great conversation today with Robby Miller, and we'll be right back after a short break.
I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, and joining us today in studio, Robby Miller, talking about high-level consumable management in sterile processing. So, Robby, you're the closer for the episode. You know, you're that pitcher that, hey, we're just about to win the game, but we want to make sure to get across the finish line, get it back in the dugout. I don't know what my sports metaphors are here. Either way, we're pulling you in to make sure that we land this plane, not only from the high level, but also, from the ground floor. Like, what do technicians have to do with all these consumable conversations that we've talked about in the previous episodes? So yeah, welcome to the show, Robby.
Well, thanks, Hank. I appreciate you and the Beyond Clean team for having me here today to talk about this very important topic. And I'm a huge baseball fan, so if I was a closer coming in, I would want the song Enter Sandman playing while nice. I run in to take the field. So excited to be here.
Okay. So I know enough about baseball to maybe know some guys. So who's your favorite closer?
Favorite closer? Ooh.
Yeah, all time.
Oh, favorite closer all time? Oh, man. That's a tough question. I'm a Diamondbacks fan, unfortunately, and we haven't had a lot of them. So I would probably say Mariano Rivera from the Yankees. I mean, he's one of the best ever.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. I've played a little bit of fantasy baseball in my time, and that's really the way that I got to know players. So outside of that, I don't even watch real games. I just do fantasy baseball from time to time, but I do know that name. So that's great. Okay. So back to the topic at hand, of course, consumables. So to take a step back, we've talked about all the technical aspects of everything from buoy dick tests to chemical indicators in this season. And I just want to ask, from that manager leadership perspective, Why is it important to manage the consumable process in a department? Why should someone be paying attention to what's going on with all these different products?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, from a leadership perspective, we are running a small business, and, oftentimes this small business that we are operating has a large budget larger than many small businesses probably in your area. And so, there's a few really important reasons, and it starts with being good stewards of those resources. We do have to come in on budget, understanding your book of business and what you're spending money on while you're making decisions to have an operating department that is focused on quality, right? Keeping patients safe, keeping your staff safe. And it's really about giving them the resources that they need to be successful in their role, right? As leaders, we're often a liaison between the folks in the trenches doing the hard work and making sure that they have those resources available to them to be successful, whether we're following standards, following IFUs, following quality assurance processes to ensure patient safety, because that's really what it's all about. So be a good steward, have a good program in place to meet those standards, and protect your staff and your patients that are coming to your facility.
Yeah, we've talked on the podcast a number of times about the gap in understanding the business that comes into managing or running sterile processing departments, and really the transition, from a frontline technician or maybe even supervisor one day to now you're the one sitting in the manager chair. And it's not like the light bulb goes on and you automatically just know everything you need to manage a $1, $2, $3, $5 million budget. And yet it's laid right in front of you, like you mentioned. So, personally, how did you start, or how did you grow in just that business mindset that you laid out? Like, was that a mentorship relationship? Did you get that through college training programs? Kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, I think mentorship is really, really important. And I was blessed to have an amazing mentor when I was developing into a leader from a technician role. So that's certainly part of it. I think, my background, my education that I've received also helped me from a business perspective, a financial minded perspective. If we do think about, we're not only leading people, we are managing a business here. Each department that we lead is its own small business within your whole operation. So I think both of those factors are really important. But then I think as a leader, you want to grow and develop. And it's really about just learning as much as you can so that you can be successful in your role, and understanding the consumables, the products you're choosing to bring in, that you're spending your money on as a unit, as a facility, is part of that. And so just, being invested as a leader to learn that part of the operation, it's not our money in our pocket, but at the same time, we are responsible for making these decisions that ultimately cost a lot of money. Healthcare is expensive, right? So understand what decisions you're making and use objective data available to you to make those decisions and be successful.
Yeah, you brought up, Robby, the role that technicians play. And I know I kind of plugged that at the beginning of the intro to this interview. And I was going to save this question till the end, but I'm just going to ask it now because the topic is fresh. It's one thing for the manager to feel the weight and responsibility of that budget on their shoulder, because that's in their job description. That's their role, right? Manage this budget, make sure that you come in underneath budget. And you're the one sitting in the office with your director or with the CFO at the end of the year, like, what's going on with this budget, But the technicians, they're not necessarily having to answer for going above budget on your consumable spend, for instance. What have you found successful, or where would you want to focus if you were trying to get that buy-in and that understanding all the way down to the front line? Not necessarily, they don't need to know everything and have every thought process that a manager does, but it's important to have them bought in and understanding their role in you hitting budget every year.
Yeah, so there definitely is a role, to be had at the technician level as part of that stewardship of resources that we talk about, being mindful of the products that we're using them appropriately, not wasting product. And so it starts with, you've got to educate technicians. You've got to have conversations about why we don't just wear gowns around the department to stay warm, right? We've all seen that. But you've got to have those conversations about not being wasteful with product. How many chemical indicators are you putting in a tray? What is your process? That we're not needlessly wasting wrappers. Part of it's education to process itself. Care and handling, for example, to minimize holes in wrappers that cause us extra work and more wrappers, right, which is money. So, there's those conversations you can have in your huddles to really just enlighten people about costs. And then there's those educational opportunities that we can teach people how to appropriately use products. And then I'd say lastly, one thing we do every SPD week as leaders is we actually take that week and we always play a game. It's kind of like The Price is Right, where we actually use our real products and share the costs and actually educate the staff and make it fun with prizes and things if they can figure out how much something costs. And it's really eye-opening for them when you're talking about some of these things like biological indicators or your sterilant for your low-temp sterilizer, your high-level disinfection chemistries, and how quickly it adds up.
Wow. I love that game. I had never heard someone playing that game, with your own supplies, right? But yeah, I can totally see the value there. Like we did something similar to the operating room on, hey, like how much does this scope cost that you're breaking every time we send it up to the OR? And like we had a picture of like a used car and it was like, $3,000 this. That was back, 5 or 6 years ago when you can get a $3,000 used car. But, the consumable piece, really, really interesting. That's a great shout out to specific, maybe the next year's sterile processing week for folks to tie that in because that financial awareness even of just asking the questions and having it on the forefront of your mind that it's not just the manager's job. It's not just the director's job. It's all of our jobs. To be cognizant of that, I think that's really, really important. Let's get into maybe some more of the practical approach and application to these insights that you've been sharing already on just maybe let's start with new consumables. So if you listen to this Beyond Clean season and maybe you heard something about your buoy dicks and you're like, you know what, I'm going to try a new buoy dick. Or I'm going to try a new biological indicator, based on some things that I heard. From that leader perspective, again, in the context of what we're talking about in managing this high-level process, what are some things that you would consider and that you would encourage other leaders to consider as they're onboarding new consumable products like this?
Yeah. So first, when we're considering new products, we look at various things like contracts. Many of us are part of a big healthcare system. And so, there might be certain products that we're being asked to look at, even convert to. We always look at cost and quality. Both of those are very, very important. But then when it's actually time to implement a new product, there are certain products where just evaluating what it's going to cost, looking at a cost analysis of your current spend with your current product, or what additional costs you're going to incur by bringing something completely new in that you haven't been using is really, really important. Some products you really do need to trial, right? Some products you don't. Evaluation, looking at it, looking at the cost, holding it is enough to make a decision. But then there are other products, these consumables, that you really should rapid cycle test, as I call it. We're going to bring it in for a week. We're going to bring it in for a month, whatever, based on that product and actually try it out and then get feedback from our staff, get feedback from those who are using it, get feedback from the operating room. So it is product specific in what we're trying. But in those situations, we would certainly bring them in, do an in-service, educate the staff, explain to them that there's a trial going on, and we're really asking you for your feedback, and we're going to come back in X amount of time, a week from now, 2 weeks from now, and ask for your feedback, or maybe even use a survey with the staff to gather that feedback before making an ultimate decision. I would say there are some products where it's the leader's decision to say we're going to use this product or not, and in some products, the staff are actually going to have, some input as to making a decision as to whether or not it's the best product for them to use.
You're reminding me about an interview that we did a couple of seasons ago on our chemical epicenter season. I think it was. We interviewed Sarah Vincent about converting your chemicals. And we just spent, a half an hour talking about very similar topics to your point here about, hey, there's some things like chemicals that you really need to trial to see if you like it. What does it smell like? Does it leave a residue? Does the technician like it? Does it make it hard to see in the sink? All those kinds of things that you just can't really tell by looking at the bottle or the brochure. So that's a point, well taken. And there's a couple of different categories here of evaluation that you want to roll out there. I did want to ask, maybe on the flip side of, have you had any experiences that you learned the hard way about trialing or, switching products around consumables that you could kind of say, hey, this is what not to do because we learned along the way?
Yeah, I would say probably chemistries are one of the biggest challenges to convert with. And so I have learned the hard way, specifically with chemistries that you want to have your staff input on them for the various things that you just talked about, like, hey, this is really making me nauseous, the smell of the chemical, right? Or it is making it more difficult for me to see the instruments, and I'm worried about, getting poked by a sharp towel clip or something like that. Very, very challenging. And it's also important to really make sure that you're engaged with your vendor partners. Respect that relationship that you have with your vendors. They're an important part of the whole cog. And so having, close dialogue with your vendors about what your intentions are, what your needs are, and being really upfront and open and honest is only going to help you sustain those relationships with those vendor partners and help you navigate the various products that are on the market. And then I would say the last thing is, as a leader, make sure you know what products are out there. We're constantly having those drop-ins, right? Vendors want to show you this or that. And it's like, oh, another salesperson. You should look at it really in the opposite way. It's an opportunity for me to know more about products that are available to me and my team, right? So make sure you really understand what is out there and take every opportunity to get familiar with it. It's only going to help you make good decisions later.
Yeah, that transparency piece that you mentioned is really important, but it's really hard because there has been, not only in our space, but I think all of healthcare, there's kind of been an us versus them mentality for decades for various reasons, but we kind of, it's the dark side, the vendor side is the dark side, the line side is the clinician side, and neither of the twain shall meet. And, to your point, though, the more honest you are with, especially in this conversation around consumable onboarding, what's really on the table and what's not on the table, because one of the worst things to do to your vendor partners is to give them the impression that there's a chance, kind of like that Dumb and Dumber. So you're saying there's a chance. Well, 1 in a million. Yeah, there's a chance, I guess. But especially for these trials, right? Chemical trials, many times the vendors, that's part of their sales process is, step one for them is get the trial. And so if you're doing a trial, but already that you're not going to be onboarding this chemical, save the time, save the heart, save the confusion on behalf of the vendor and your team. Just don't do that trial unless it's a really live option. So, it's hard being that honest because sometimes there's vendors, fewer than most, but sometimes there's vendors that try to take advantage of that kind of information, so you need to be aware of that. But to try to play that game of not telling the whole truth, only telling some of the truth, leading folks on, it just ends up getting everyone burned and disappointed, and the industry's too small to operate like that. So that's a point well taken. Well, let me ask you this about comparative consumables in the market. What role does education play in your decision-making process around companies that sell, some of these more commodity type consumables, although I think arguments can be made maybe that those don't exist in sterile processing. There's always enough differentiation and nuance, but that's besides the point. When you're making decisions even on behalf of your team, are you thinking about this education piece and saying, which one of these three companies, for instance, are going to be able to support me the best on onboarding, on upkeep, on continuing education around this particular product?
Yeah, that's a very important factor when you're determining what consumables you're going to choose to utilize. It's not just cost and quality, but it's thinking about those staff that are having to use the product, right? How is it going to impact their workflow? How are we going to make sure that they're going to be successful using some of these products? Obviously, some consumables are less complex than others, but there are some consumables that have some real complexity to them that we need to make sure staff are trained and competent in using the products safely. And so, we do look at some of the value-added items that vendors have to offer, whether that is education. Are they local? Are they going to be able to be here to support us when we need them during an implementation or thereafter with ongoing education? That certainly is a factor that we have to consider as leaders. But the most important thing is just really, I'm a process-oriented leader. So we've got to define process using the products, the resources available to set our staff up in being successful in the very complex roles that they are working in today, right? SPD is complex. We all know that. They've got to be very meticulous and detail-oriented. We've got to set them up for success. So it's important to even consider how these products work. Is your chemical indicator for your steam, is the change in color, or is it migrating and contradict what you're using for low-temp sterilization? Is that going to be confusing for your staff or the end user in the operating room, right? So we've got to kind of look at all those factors.
So what about on the back end? You've implemented a product, and let's say that you're encountering some issues, some quality issues around either how the consumable is working or how it's being received or perceived by the customer on the other end, say the operating room. But when you deal with quality challenges, how do you create a staff dynamic where they feel comfortable coming back to you, even though you made the decision after coming back and be like, boss, this indicator that we chose is just, it's not doing it. Like, how do you create that dynamic?
Yeah, so I know in my organization, we focus a lot on what we call high reliability, a high reliability organization. We focus heavily on safety. And so it starts by just creating an environment where people can bring up these issues. We call it safety huddle. We start off every shift, every day, 3 times a day with our huddle, which, does a lot of other things, getting assignments, but it starts with safety. And we talk about products in these safety huddles, and we encourage a forum where the staff can speak up and share the concerns they have with, the products and the environment that they're working in. So that's the first part, really making sure that staff have an opportunity to voice their opinion, their thoughts on the work that they're doing and what's impacting them. I think when we're talking about quality issues as well, it's always important to partner with your vendor, right? Don't keep information from them. Talk to your vendor. Share the experiences that you're having with your vendor. Give your vendor an opportunity to address them. That's really, really important rather than just jumping ship necessarily. But you've got to kind of listen to both sides, and it's going to help you make decisions on how to proceed. Or do we need to move to another product? Do we need to focus on education because staff aren't using it quite right? Make sure you are having that dialogue with your team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great word for any vendors that are tuning in, that no news is not necessarily good news. It could just be that you're not getting the news that there is to get. So that FaceTime, way back to your earlier point, is really important. It's not, you're not just there, to introduce a new product. You're there to also say, especially on the consumable side, hey, how's everything going with the stuff you're already using from us, and where are some opportunities, to add more education, provide any more value or support, to that relationship. Of course, as we kind of alluded to before, there's big budget implications to these decisions. And I am just kind of curious, as you look forward, into surgical growth into the next year, maybe you're adding on a couple more service lines, maybe a new dock, maybe you're opening up a new tower. How do you sit down and make sure that you're budgeting appropriately for consumable growth in addition to the surgical volume that you're planning for as an organization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. As we talked about before, understanding your book of business is so important. And so, first of all, I would encourage all leaders, figure out how to get a PO history and understand what you're spending money on, how much you're spending on what products, so that you can really understand where there might be opportunities to find savings in some products, right? And then at the same time, it's really, really important that we track the big business decisions we're making, right? So if we're bringing in a new product, for example, you've been experiencing a bunch of holes in wrappers and you're like, all right, maybe we're going to use corner protectors, right? We want to make sure that we are tracking and documenting those significant changes. So when it's time to go to budget, we can account for that expense, that variance expense that we are going to see in next year's budget, because, some products can really be quite expensive. And so it's important that you can articulate to your finance teams why we need X amount of dollars more in the budget, or why we're spending X amount of dollars more than last year in the budget because we implemented these products. And just the same, if we're discontinuing products, or we found cost savings opportunity, you move from one vendor to another for a like product to realize savings, let's also make sure we're tracking that as well, so we can articulate that decrease and celebrate those successes as leaders.
Yeah. Tracking that savings, especially if it's a promise of savings, but maybe it's realized, maybe it's not, but how are you going to know unless you're actually tracking that from year to year? To your point, really, really good tip for any new leader or old leader who just hasn't been doing that piece of the puzzle yet. So, Robby, let me close maybe with this question. This is kind of a hot potato question, but it wouldn't do justice to this topic without asking you this. I know from the manager side and director side, when I was on the other side of the table, there's always these conversations from manufacturers who provide capital equipment to use their consumables with the equipment. Granted, it's going to be very difficult to paint with any kind of broad brush in this answer, so I'll just kind of give you that at the beginning. But how do you think through that dynamic of, I spent, tens of thousands, sometimes over 100,000 in capital, and now I'm deciding, do I use these indicators? Do I use this chemical? Do I use these tests in order to test this capital equipment that's on brand? How do you kind of work through those decisions?
Yeah, I think it always comes back to the IFU first, right? And we've all been in those situations, whether it's the low temp sterilizer and what quality assurance products you're going to put in it, or it's the washer disinfector and what chemistry are you going to use inside of that unit. It does come back to really understanding your IFUs. The IFUs of not only the equipment, but the IFU of the product, right? And so if, say, for example, a biological indicator is validated for various units, I would say it's acceptable to use in that unit. There might even be some realized benefits of using on-brand products with the capital equipment from the same manufacturer, shorter cycle times, things like that. Those are decisions that you're going to need to take into account when you're really truly evaluating cost and benefit. That's what it boils down to, cost versus benefit, right? So if there's significant cost savings in using off-brand, but it does fall in line with IFUs, there's nothing in the IFUs that forbid you from doing that, or maybe you have a little longer cycle time, that's something you're going to need to determine as a leader. But it always starts with your IFU. Certainly we're not going to use any product off-label if the IFU specifically forbids it. Right. But I think there are sometimes opportunities to get away from the classic printer toner kind of market, right? Because that's where the real money is made, is in the consumables being used in the capital equipment.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, we almost made it a full interview without the word IFU coming out in the interview on this consumable season, but you saved us like a good saver always does, good closer. And yeah, Robby, really appreciate this high level insight. We provided a lot of tips and tricks, and my favorite is definitely going to be the Price is Right game. So I want to get some more information about you offline on that and try to get that out to the masses, because I think that's extremely valuable. But yeah, I really appreciate your time today.
No, my pleasure being here, and thank you, Hank, and thank you to the Beyond Clean team for having me. It was a lot of fun, so I appreciate it.
And that was Robby Miller, Manager, Sterile Processing Department, Dignity Health, St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona. So listeners, great conversation there. As I said at the end of the interview, the Price is Right game to be able to identify and just kind of visualize again what these things cost, what all these consumables cost that we're using per indicator, per test, per ounce of chemistry. That stuff adds up very quickly over 3 shifts, 24/7 days a week and 365 days a year if your hospital's running that often. But either way, we use a lot of consumables, and these budgets, like Robby said, can be very, very large. So for me, the big takeaway, and one of the things I want you to walk away with on this interview, is this is not just a manager's decision or a manager's responsibility. This is every member of a sterile processing team has a part to play in managing these consumables. It's not just about the budget, mind you. It is about quality, as we referenced in the interview as well. If you got a quality concern, you need to be escalating that back up into those decision makers so that they can change the product, or maybe even just notify the manufacturer to get a new lot number in, something as simple as that. But they can't change it if they don't know about it. I hope you enjoyed this season all about consumables, and we really appreciated all the feedback and insights that our guests provided throughout the season, and that the audience and listeners like you have emailed in or commented through social media. We can't wait to talk to you again on season 23. But after this next episode, we're going to be doing a handful of re-releases and mid-season releases to close out the year, and then we'll hit you back up the first week of January. With that, I'd like to remind you to keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.